All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Josh Eidelson. Josh is a labor journalist, a contributing writer for Salon, The Nation, In These Times, all of which and more you can find at josheidelson.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Josh Eidelson. Josh, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thank you so much for having me back, Matt.
All right, so Josh, you've been on the show many, many times to discuss various aspects of the labor movement, and you recently wrote a really great piece for the American Prospect on the alt labor movement. So tell us, what exactly do you mean by alt labor?
So alt labor is a very broad category, but when I talk about alt labor, what I'm talking about is the whole range of labor organizations that are mobilizing workers in some way, trying to change conditions in workplaces, but aren't doing it through collective bargaining, aren't seeking legal recognition as a union under the National Labor Relations Act. Now, there are reasons that these groups have proliferated. In fact, they've exploded over the past 2 decades, from about 5 in the United States to a couple hundred. Many of these groups are organizing workers who legally can't have a union because U.S. labor law literally excludes growing sectors of the workforce. Whether you're a farm worker or you're, say, a fashion model who's considered to be an independent contractor under the law, you have no legal right to collective bargaining. But some of these groups are organizing workers who legally could form a union but have recognized that labor law is terrible. U.S. labor law is totally broken if the goal is actually to protect people's right to free association and democracy in the workplace. And so increasingly we see workers turning to alternatives, and we see unions increasingly collaborating with these groups.
So let's discuss some of the groups, some of the examples of alt labor. Let's start actually with there are restaurant workers. Let's start with that and move on to some of the things like someone like taxi drivers and whatnot.
Sure. So the Restaurant Opportunity Center is a group that organizes restaurant workers. These are workers who, under law, theoretically could have a union on paper, but as your longtime listeners know, having a right on paper doesn't mean that you can actually vindicate it in the workplace. So for all of the reasons, the rise of union busting, the ways that companies get away with intimidating people, the changes in the workforce, all of the things that make it actually very difficult to form a union, most restaurant workers don't have union recognition. And the Restaurant Opportunity Center is one of 3 groups I talk about specifically in the piece that cropped up locally in New York and since have gone national. So their model, like each of these groups, is you use a range of different tactics to put pressure on the boss outside of collective bargaining. One of the leaders of the Restaurant Opportunity Center said to me, our strategy is to surround the industry. So what do? They sue companies, not under what we often think of as union law, but they sue companies over things like stealing people's wages by not paying them, over racial discrimination, over not paying people's overtime. They do street theater and protest tactics. They picket companies. They march in front of buildings. They target customers in order to hurt the company's ability to do business. They reach out. There's a good cop approach also, where they encourage companies to get validated by them as ethical employers that do provide people paid sick leave and follow the law and so on. They train workers in how to organize some of their coworkers and push for changes in the workplace. And so it's this, and then they also try to pass laws at the state level, at the federal level, that would raise the legal standard. And so that combination of tactics typifies what many of these alt labor groups are doing, but it's important to keep in mind that range of tactics also increasingly is what unions do, because collective bargaining by itself has proven not to accomplish that much if your boss doesn't want to play ball.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm talking to Josh Eidelson, labor journalist. You actually write in the piece how a good deal of the alt labor movement actually stemmed from taxi drivers in New York City in the 90s, correct?
So this was one of the most dramatic and most significant victories that any alt-labor group has had in the United States. And it does go to show collective bargaining is not in and of itself the same thing as power in the workplace. So the taxi workers are an exceptional case, but they're really an instructive one. Because these were workers who had unions, had legal union recognition under the law, had health insurance, had pensions, and then under deregulation a couple decades ago, everything got washed away. Overnight, these workers went from being employees who had union recognition to quote-unquote independent contractors who have to pay all kinds of fees, have to maintain their own vehicles, and on paper don't have a boss that they can force to negotiate with them about anything. And so for decades, these workers were bereft of all of these benefits they had had. Many people saw them as unorganizable. And then they started organizing. And the most significant thing they did was they went on strike. And they actually prevented the majority of the city's taxis from running for a day in New York City. They humiliated Mayor Rudy Giuliani, which is always an accomplishment in and of itself. And
when he doesn't humiliate himself, but it's always fun to actually humiliate him. That's most definitely true.
Yeah, he called it street theater, but meanwhile the cabs weren't running. And to be clear, these taxi drivers had certain advantages in that because you have to be licensed to drive a cab, for example, it makes it more difficult for them to be replaced. But what was the most significant is they did face-to-face organizing for years to get people ready to go out and do that. And they demonstrated that you can wield some significant industrial power without sitting across the legal negotiating table. And once they had done that, once they had established this pattern, they did it a couple more times over the years, of going on strike and showed that they could shut down effectively taxi service in the city, well, then they had power and they just needed a venue where they could turn that power into some kind of concrete commitment. And that was the Taxi Regulatory Commission, the Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York, which the drivers all hated because they saw it as designed to find various ways to overregulate them and tamper with them and punish them. But in one of the drivers' words, the Taxi and Limousine Commission became a vehicle for the drivers. Once they established clout, once they were able to scare the city's politicians by going on strike, then they were able to actually take this commission and use it as an alternative place to bargain, where they're de facto negotiating with the boss because the boss sits at one end of the table, they sit at the other, and most recently they were able to legislate themselves health insurance for the first time.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
So now when people ride in cabs, the surcharge has gone up, and part of the money is going to go into a new fund for health insurance. There's also greater regulation on the medallion owners, this whole Byzantine system. But the people who own the cabs who get fabulously wealthy off of them while not working, a not unfamiliar phenomenon in the American economy, those folks are now being more strictly regulated in terms of their ability to gouge the people who actually do the work driving the cabs.